Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinette. Between 1652 and 1674, England and the Netherlands fought 3 maritime wars on grounds of commercial and naval rivalry. The Third Anglo-Dutch War put the British colony of New York at risk in 1673. Let's travel back with Eric Yanis of the Other States of America podcast to learn more about this remarkable time in North American history.
In June of 1672, a war had broken out between England and the Netherlands, the Third Anglo-Dutch War. Now, what's going on in the English Middle Colonies? We have to travel over across the Atlantic to the Netherlands. The actors in this story, by and large, will not be English governors. They are background people. They're moving set pieces around. But the real stars from the onset had no intention of creating a new Netherland. With the outbreak of hostilities between England and the Netherlands, ships of the Dutch Republic could now hunt down English ships, and vice versa. The political organization of the Netherlands, as it was then, is not what it is today. Now we think of it as a unified state. But in the 1670s, it was and had been for some time a confederation of provinces, which meant that sometimes the individual pieces of this larger collective competed with one another, or enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, even if there were some overarching authority figure above all, usually by design ineffective, very limited. Now, this also applied to the Navy of the Netherlands, which consisted of 5 admiralties, who could work jointly, but were just as likely to conduct independent operations. Our story is taking us to the Admiralty of Zeeland. Zeeland is a province of the Netherlands, and historically is the only province that could truly rival Holland as a naval power. And with the outbreak of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, it was the Admiralty of Zeeland that sought to enrich itself off of taking English ships and their cargo. Cornelis Everson, the younger, from a very famous naval family, was made admiral and tasked with this important mission. He was given 6 ships and 586 men. These men would be a mixture of sailors and marines, with a smattering of those who had other specialties. Specifically and originally, they were tasked with taking ships that belonged to the English East India Company, an up-and-coming rival to the Dutch East India Company. Under Everson would be a man by the name of Anthony Colve, who would be in charge of the Marines. Also from a prominent family, Colve likely came from a branch of what used to be a noble family, but no longer held title, but still had some means, still had some money. In 1672, when they set out, he's about 28 years old. Without getting too much into the Dutch politics of the time, Colve's family were by and large Orangists, which meant they supported the Prince of Orange, the Stadtholder. Having recently been restored during this year, the Stadtholder was a sort of head of state. Whereas other European countries were monarchies and had a king or queen, the confederacy that was the Netherlands would have this Stadtholder from this point until well into the 18th century. This figure was not as powerful as a king and could never take on the name of a king or a queen. They couldn't take on that title, rather. In fact, if you look at the etymology of the word Stadtholder, you'll see it means like placeholder. So this is a person that in other times and places might be called a steward. The Prince of Orange would have some of the powers you would associate with a king, and yet many of those powers would be by de facto rather than de jure, and while being honored with the title of prince, he would never become a king over the Netherlands, at least until after the time of Napoleon. The Prince of Orange, coming of age by 1672 and fighting political opposition with the help of his Orangists, became the Stadtholder. And so Colve was not just a military man, he was also politically connected. All the better for the Zeelanders to include him in their plans for the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The small fleet left in November of 1672, hunting for those English ships. And it appears they bit off a little more than they could chew. In February of 1673, they were just off the shore of Cape Verde, which is an island off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic Ocean. and they came upon an English fleet, a fleet much larger than theirs. And the mission of the English fleet was to hunt down ships belonging to the Dutch East India Company. And the English had the clear numerical superiority. And so Everson did something smart. After nearly being trapped by the English fleet, he threw over much of the fleet's cargo and made a speedy getaway. However, now, in the open Atlantic Ocean, it became clear that their primary objective, at least in the form of taking ships from the English East India Company, later it will become the British East India Company, but not here in 1673, this was a target they weren't going to hit. The Dutch fleet was just too small, they had just lost a lot of their supplies, and the English ships heading for the Eastern Hemisphere seemed to be well prepared for any Dutch attack. But Everson knew this couldn't be the end of his expedition. If he returned home and only reported one quick escape, well, couldn't others just color this interaction as a retreat, as a loss? Especially since he'll be returning home with less than he left with. No, Everson wouldn't have it. He decided it was now time to go to the Caribbean, and perhaps there he could find easier targets. Well, Everson did find easier targets. He also found another Dutch fleet. This one coming from the Admiralty of Holland. Remember, although technically all part of the same navy, they operated fairly independent of one another. This was a small fleet of 6 ships, commanded by Jacob Banks. They were tasked with capturing English and French ships in the Caribbean. Both fleets separately were small to medium in size. With Everson having the Marines, both fleets put together could actually be quite formidable. And so both Everson and Banks decided to join forces. Again, we see a mixture of official orders being part of a branch of the military, mixed with a little bit of the entrepreneurial spirit, with a little dose of free will. Together, they cleaned up a large swath of the Caribbean, both at sea and at shore, where they eventually received information that north in Virginia, the tobacco planters would soon be exporting their crop, and there would be a large number of small merchant operations to bring that cargo elsewhere. And so Everson and Banks, far stronger collectively, and only greater still after taking ships in the Caribbean, went north to Virginia, where they caught a great number of English ships by surprise, and gained a fortune in tobacco. But, more importantly to our story, on one ship was James Carteret, his wife, and his friend Samuel Hopkins. You see, it was during this year, 1673, that Governor Carteret received confirmation of his authority in the New World. Although the governor had not yet returned from England, his paperwork did, and the illegal government headed by James Carteret fell apart quickly, and he was no longer welcome in New York or New Jersey, being seen as a liability. And now the Dutch fleet had picked him up in a ship off the coast of Virginia. Now, we don't exactly know what James Carteret told the Dutch. However, we do know that instead of being taken hostage, which a member of the Carteret family could return a nice profit for you, Carteret and his wife were dropped off on the coast of Virginia on July 21st. Meanwhile, his friend, Hopkins, stayed with the Dutch. Not exactly a prisoner. And then the Dutch fleet, who originally had their eye on heading to Newfoundland, decided instead that there might be some opportunities a little closer to Virginia, in the areas that we would call New Jersey and New York. Which begs the question, what did James Carteret tell them? Now we're getting into the area of speculation, but it explains the behavior of the Dutch in this case. It's likely that James Carteret informed the Dutch as to the political condition of the colony of New Jersey and New York. How New Jersey was in shambles, had 2 competing governments, and its fellow English colony of New York simply didn't believe that New Jersey legally existed. Meanwhile, New York had its own problems, with much of Long Island being settled by New Englanders who really didn't want to be under the yoke of the Duke of York. And sprinkled all throughout were other ethnic groups, including a heavy dose of the Dutch, who simply did not have any strong allegiance to English authority. In the case of New Jersey, of course, that English authority was non-existent. There was no governor in the colony. The Dutch fleet decided, well, it's worth a look. On July 28, 1673, the fleet took sight of New York Bay, and they came to anchor off of Sandy Hook the next day on the 29th.
The presence of the Dutch fleet on the shores of a former Netherlands colony quickly aroused the long smoldering fires of patriotism and support in the hearts of many former Dutch citizens of New Netherland.
That night, several farmers from the town of New Utrecht on Long Island and from Staten Island made their way out to the fleet and boarded the Zeeland flagship, Schwanenberg. These farmers confirmed much of what the Dutch fleet probably learned from James Carteret. They complained about English rule. They claimed that Governor Lovelace wasn't even in the colony and certainly wasn't in Fort James, the fort at the bottom of Manhattan Island. And a plan began to form in the minds of Banks and Everson that maybe through their combined efforts, they don't just have to raid and pillage. They don't just have to take ships off the coast. While they had already done their share of profiteering, maybe they could do a little state building. If the information they received was accurate, between their ships of war and the Marines under Captain Cole, they could take Fort James, which at the time served as a sort of military and political capital of the colony of New York.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.